we are connecting.
All right, and I assume I can share my screen without.
Oh yeah, you can go ahead and check.
Okay, cool.
Perfect, and we are on Facebook. So let me mute myself. All right, everyone, welcome back to our Ask a Scientist series with the Asheville Museum of Science. I'm very excited to be back after we had 3 weeks of kind of repeat speakers. So now we have someone brand new today. Our talk today is going to feature Dr. Erin Kane, and she is a postdoctoral researcher at Boston University. Erin is interested in the ways primates can respond to a rapidly changing environment. And her postdoctoral research focuses on growth and development and really understanding what they eat and how they become successful adults to have more orangutans. So I'm very excited to hear this talk. It should be really interesting and exciting and something completely different than we've talked about before. So without any more talking from me, Dr. Erin, I will pass it off to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. Let me just get my screen shared here. Can you see my screen? Perfect. Okay, cool. So like Abigail said, my name is Erin Kane. I'm a postdoc at Boston University, and today I'm going to talk to you about why orangutans have such long childhoods. So before we get into the actual nitty-gritty of orangutans, I wanted to give you a little bit of detail about primatology and what primatologists do, because I would define myself first and foremost as a primatologist. So primatology is just the study of the behavior, ecology, anatomy, and evolution of non-human primates. So we basically, everything there is to know about primates, we're interested in knowing it. But if you go and look at my graduate transcript, you'll see that my PhD is not in something called primatology, it's in anthropology. And this often strikes people as a little bit strange because, as you probably know, anthropology is the scientific study of human cultural and biological variation and evolution, right? So you think of anthropologists going off to, exciting places and studying the things that people are doing and the ways that they're living their lives. You don't often think about people who go and study monkeys, right? And primatology is actually a subfield within anthropology. And what we're able to do is, just like cultural anthropologists put humans in this kind of cross-cultural perspective to understand the diversity of human behavior. What primatologists do is we put humans into a biological cross-species perspective, right? So by studying our closest living relatives, the modern primates, we're able to think about kind of how do humans compare to the other organisms that we're really closely related to. The other useful thing about primates is that throughout most of human evolution, we were, doing things that are really similar to what modern primates are doing now. We shared kind of evolutionary heritage with them. And so there are lots of ways that studying the modern primates can help us understand sort of the forces that were shaping the evolution of modern humans. So with that in mind, I probably don't have to tell you this, but humans have really big brains. So this graph shows the relative brain size on this axis up here and the relative body size of different organisms. So if you have a brain size relative to your body size that falls on this black line, your brain's about as big as we expect. If it's above that line, it's much bigger than we expect. And as you can see, humans fall above that line. So this is something that is really distinct about humans. We have a much bigger brain than our body size would predict. And this is something that humans are pretty proud of, right? This is, our brains are something that is unique and exciting and pretty excellent about being a human, right? We can trace our brain size kind of growing across human evolution. So if you go back to our earlier ancestors, you can see that they had smaller brains and it sort of is something that gets bigger. So this is something we think probably is important across our evolutionary heritage. And we can compare ourselves to kind of other modern primates and other organisms and see, this is something unique and excellent about the humans. Yes.
I just want to say I cannot believe squirrels are above the line.
I know, right? You wouldn't think it. Not that much above the line, but think about their ecological adaptation. They have to remember where those nuts are, right? And don't overlook the squirrel. So basically having a big brain is an exciting thing about being humans, and we in particular are very excited about this. So there are a bunch of consequences to having these really big brains, and one of them is that humans have really helpless babies with very long childhoods. It takes a lot of effort and time for our brains to get kind of big enough that we're able to function and do things, right? And so humans rely on lots of other people, not just their mothers, to keep babies alive throughout the course of their long childhood. And one of the reasons we think we have such a long childhood is because it gives our large brains time to grow and develop, right? So kids go off to school while their brains are still growing and developing, and they become enculturated. They learn all of the things that they need to learn in order to be functional humans, right? So you learn how to read, you learn how to share, you learn how to do math. You also learn sort of your social context, right? So you learn how to behave with authority figures. You learn how to behave with your friends and how that's different than with your parents, for example. So when we think about sort of the things that drive our big brain and our extended childhood, we often turn to our complicated social system as sort of the driver for this pace of evolution. Now, what's cool is if we look across the living primates to sort of put humans into this cross-species context, we see that most primates are also really social, and they also have really long childhoods. And in a lot of cases, their childhoods are comprised of sort of learning how to be, in this case, a good baboon. And part of what that means is learning how, who you can interact with, who's dominant to you, who's dominant to your mother, how does that change the ways that you behave? Who do you groom, who grooms you, right? So if we look across the primates, who have generally pretty long childhoods, again, this sort of social explanation for these really long childhoods makes a lot of sense. Now, if we look at orangutans actually have the longest childhood of any primate and really of any mammal. So orangutans have a 7 to 9 year interbirth interval. So what that means is females only have a baby once every 7 to 9 years. And for the intervening time, the mother is sort of focused entirely on that one baby. So they have a really, really long period of growth and development where they are sort of the sole focus of their mother. And we might think since they have such a long childhood, they're really, really socially complex. But it turns out that they're actually semi-solitary. So basically, orangutans spend the vast majority of their time moving through the forest by themselves, maybe with their baby if it's a mother with an infant, but they very, very rarely interact. So I don't mean this to say that they're not socially complicated. There are actually some really interesting things about orangutan social systems that make them complicated. So in the middle, we have an adult female with her baby. This is an adult male on the right, and you can see he's got those giant cheek flanges. He's really, really large. He probably weighs between around, I would say, 300 pounds. This is a large animal. This guy over here, he's also an adult male orangutan, but he is about the same size as the females. He lacks those big cheek pouches, and he has a totally different strategy for being an adult male. So there's a lot of complexity in orangutan social systems, but it's primarily related to their reproduction. It's not something that's going to be really relevant for juveniles as they're learning how to grow and function as, a 6 or 7 year old orangutan. Orangutans don't reach sexual maturity until they're about 11, 12, 13, 14. So they're complex, but they're not complex in a way that I think would really drive the evolution of a really, really long childhood, right? So there must be some other explanation for why orangutans have such long childhoods. If it's not because they're living in this complex social group with, 40 other orangutans that they need to interact with and know how to. So to answer this question, I'm going to take you to the forest of Indonesian Borneo. This is a picture from our field site, and yeah, it looks pretty much like you imagine a rainforest looks. It's a wonderful place. So where I do my research is in Gunung Palung National Park, which is this little red dot on the island of Borneo. So orangutans are only found in 2 places in the entire world, the island of Sumatra and the island of Borneo. So those 2 islands are owned by the countries of Indonesia and Malaysia. And that's the only place where you find wild orangutans. So the work that we do is centered sort of at this point in the national park. It's about a 5-hour hike from the nearest village. And our actual camp is located right at the base of this mountain. So you can see the mountains in the background here. That's the mountains that are on this map. And the orangutans move around the forest. Some of them are mostly in the swamps, some of them go up in the mountains, but this is their environment. And so what's really interesting about the forests that orangutans live in is that they're totally different in terms of their fruiting than the forests that we're used to. So in the United States, and really in most places in the world, including most tropical rainforests, there's a really predictable annual pattern of fruiting. So we know every September and October, the apples are going to be, we're going to be able to go pick apples. Over the summer, we know there will be strawberries, right? This is something that happens at the same time every year. This is really predictable. The forests that orangutans live in are not predictable in that way. So instead of having a typical annual cycle, they have what's called massed production. So in about 85% of the trees in these forests, instead of having an annual fruiting cycle, have a really unpredictable fruiting cycle where all of the trees will produce fruit at once for a couple of months. And then for some period of time, they just don't produce fruit. And we can't say what that period of time is. It could be a year, it could be 4 years, it could be 6 months. It's really not clear, and there's really no way to predict it. There's some relationship with El Nino patterns, but it's not in such a way that I could look at El Nino and tell you in 6 months there's going to be fruit, right? And so if scientists can't do it, certainly orangutans are not able to do it. So what this means for orangutans is sometimes there is a lot of fruit available. These are some of the foods that orangutans prefer eating when there's a lot of fruit. These are foods that are high in carbohydrates, so they're really energy dense and energy rich and easy to digest. So it doesn't take a lot of kind of digestive work to get all of the energy out of these really sugary foods. Some of them are foods that humans like to eat. You might have tried durian or rambutan before, but those are some of orangutans' favorite foods as well. So when there is a lot of fruit, orangutans eat a lot of calories. If you look at this female, her name is Walima, you can see she's got 4 fruits in her mouth. She's also got a fruit in each foot. So she has been sitting in this tree. I took this picture in, I think, the 4th hour of this feeding bout. So she was just in this tree, literally stuffing her face with fruit for more than 4 hours. She was having the best day ever. So when there's a lot of fruit, orangutans eat like 4,000 or 5,000 calories. They really, really, really pack on as many calories as they can. And what's important is that when they eat those excess calories, they store them as fat. Because most of the time, they don't live in this like happy fruit wonderland. Most of the time, they are eating things like this. They're eating bark, they're eating pith, which is sort of the inner parts of twigs. They're eating unripe fruit, they're eating termites, they're eating leaves. They're eating foods that aren't really calorie dense, and that sometimes take a lot of work and even some skill to be able to open, right? So this male orangutan is really, he's eating the inside of a palm tree, right? Of a palm frond. There's not a lot of energy or nutrition in there, right? But these are the foods that are available to them. So one sort of consequence of this is we were thinking, if during these like happy fruit-filled times, they're eating lots of easy to eat foods, lots of easy to digest foods, but during these other periods when there isn't a lot of fruit, they're eating things like bark. Maybe young orangutans actually have a harder time getting enough nutrition than adults do. If we look at the shape of orangutans' jaws and teeth and skulls, so their morphology, right? Their morphology looks like they have evolved to eat sort of mechanically protected foods. They have really powerful chewing muscles. You can see sort of the ridge on this skull. That's where the muscles that attach the jaw to the skull and allow for chewing attach, right? So those are really big, really powerful muscles. They have really thick enamel on their teeth. So orangutans are well evolved to cope with foods that they eat when there isn't a lot of ripe fruit available. But if you think about young orangutans, juveniles are smaller, they have baby teeth instead of adult teeth. Often their facial bones aren't totally fused, so they're not going to be able to open their jaws as wide or use the same amount of force that adults can use, right? So this might suggest that they have a harder time eating these kind of mechanically protected or harder to process foods. So we decided to see if this was true by actually watching videos of orangutans of different ages chewing. And what we did was we watched these videos and we counted how many times they put foods in their mouth and how many times they chewed each food with different teeth, right? So looking at their incisors versus their molars and canines. And this is a clip of Prabhu, who's a big flanged male, eating some of the same fruit that that other female was eating. And this is a young juvenile, probably maybe like 1 year old or a little bit older, eating some leaves. And so we watched a video like this, and we literally just sat and counted how many times they chewed their food. And what we were able to see is that compared to adults, kids do weird things with their food. So it's a little bit hard to see in this graph, I apologize, but we have juveniles and the ways that they're chewing their food. And what we see is that actually they go from about 0 chews. So they go as many as 35, 40 chews per food item, right? So they're chewing their food a lot. As a comparison, adult males only chew their food at most about 10 times per piece of food that they put in their mouth, and adult females at most about 12 times that they're putting foods in their mouth. So juveniles seem to be chewing a lot more. There's also a lot more variation, right? So they're just like some foods they're eating with fewer bites, some foods they're eating with more. It's weird, and it doesn't look like the ways that adults are processing food. So this means that juveniles are probably actually less efficient at processing foods than adults, right? So juveniles are working more to eat a piece of food than adults who might be eating that same piece of food. So the next question is sort of, yeah.
Just to get everyone oriented, we're a little, we are all, I believe, except for some, a little unfamiliar with the great ape evolution. So how far away are orangutans from us?
Yeah. So orangutans split off from the lineage that became modern humans about 13 million years ago. So we're more closely related to orangutans than we are to monkeys like baboons or something like that, but we're less closely related to them than we are to other great apes like gorillas or chimpanzees or bonobos. Yeah, cool. Sorry, I didn't give that important kind of background. Yeah, so thinking back to the ways that orangutans are actually eating their foods, babies aren't doing it as well as adults. So there has to be a way that they learn how to actually go about successfully eating these sort of weird foods, right? So the question is, how do they learn? So we know from looking across basically all of animals, in a lot of species, juveniles, so young primates, spend a lot of time actually observing their mother, or sometimes their father as well, eating, and they often share food. So this can be simply a way for parents to give their babies food, like you see with the penguins who are begging for food from their parents, right? Those penguins aren't learning a whole lot. They're just getting nutrition from their parents. But for a lot of primates, it's this sort of food sharing and actually observing mothers eating is a way for juveniles to learn about sort of the breadth of the diet. So the kinds of things that it's normal for an orangutan to eat, and also how to actually process those foods. The pictures in the middle here, this is a chimpanzee mother who has been termite fishing. So they, you might have seen this if you've watched videos of like Jane Goodall, where the chimpanzees have these big termite mounds and they break off sticks and then jam the sticks into the termite mound and pull out the stick covered in termites that they can eat. And that's something that actually takes a reasonable amount of skill to do. So we see that babies spend a lot of time sitting and staring at their mother while she's doing this termite fishing. And then after they leave, sometimes the babies will try to fit the sticks back in the hole. So it's definitely an opportunity for them to practice. Similarly, capuchin monkeys in Brazil actually use really heavy stones to crack open really hard seeds that they wouldn't be able to open just with their teeth. And so again, this is an adult capuchin monkey who's just successfully opened a seed with that big rock on the log next to him. And this juvenile is staring really intently, and he's watching and learning. And again, we see that a lot of times after the adults leave, the babies will try to pick up the rocks and drop them and practice, right? So we might see some sort of practicing or food sharing in orangutans, and that would help us understand how juveniles learn how to feed. Yeah.
We have one question that asks, how long do they nurse before they start eating more diverse and traditional orangutan foods?
Oh, that is a great question. So orangutans actually nurse throughout the majority of their childhood. So we have evidence that orangutans are nursing up to 7 or 8 years old. It's not a lot of kind of the calories that they get in their diet, especially as they get older. But what we see is there's sort of a relationship between how much fruit is available in their diet and how intensely we think they're nursing. So it looks like when there's a lot of fruit, older orangutans pretty much only eat fruit. But being able to rely on their mother and nurse when there isn't a lot of easy to digest food around can actually be a really important buffer that helps keep juveniles alive. I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end, because this is kind of the next question that we're getting ready to ask and collect data for. Yeah, so when we want to understand how juveniles are actually, whether they're sharing foods, what kinds of foods they're sharing with their mothers, we actually gather this data by going out and following orangutans, right? So we have an amazing team in Indonesia, primarily right now, composed of Indonesian researchers and field assistants, although during not COVID times, we also have graduate students and postdocs like me and other researchers from around the world who come to this field site. And what we do is we conduct full day follows of orangutans. So orangutans sleep in nests. They wake up sometime between 4 and 5. And we get out to their nest before they wake up and we spend a full day with them. They fall asleep again, they make themselves a night nest sometime between 5 and 6 in the evening. And so what we do is we basically just walk under them. They're in a tree doing their orangutan thing, and we collect data on everything they're doing, where they are in the canopy, how they're moving, where they're sitting, if they're eating, what kinds of foods, and so on and so forth. And so what we did here is we also record whenever we see any sort of food sharing. So we look at when adults, we compared between when adults shared food with other adults and when adults shared food with their offspring. And we looked to see actually when they were physically sharing food. So like a baby is begging and so the mother gives her a piece of fruit, or also if they're just sort of tolerating somebody feeding in the same tree as them. Orangutans, because they're not super social, will often move away if another orangutan comes into the tree that they're feeding in. And sometimes, especially as juveniles get older, mothers are less and less interested in sharing a feeding tree with, a 5 or 6 year old. So we wanted to see what they were sharing or tolerating feeding. And if there were differences in the kinds of foods that were being shared between adults and offspring, and adults and other adults. So we collect plant samples of anything that's shared, and we analyze the details of those samples both in Indonesia and then here in our lab in Boston. So we collect things like the wet weight of the food, and we also analyze the nutritional content of the food. So looking for the calories, the carbohydrates, the protein, all of the sort of nutritional content that we're interested in. And for this particular project, we also wanted to see what component of the food was non-digestible. So things like the husk of the seed, or what they were actually throwing away, the things that weren't going to be digested. And what we predicted is that mothers who were helping their offspring learn how to eat more complicated foods would be more likely to share foods that were heavy, that were kind of bigger foods, that were more, that had a kind of a higher amount of non-digestible carbohydrates, right? That were actually, there was less of it that they were able to digest. There was more of it that they had to remove. So when we look at the actual data, we looked at, again, the relationship between foods that were transferred between mother and offspring, foods that mothers kind of tolerated offspring feeding in really close proximity to them, and then foods that were transferred between adults or that were eaten when adults tolerated another individual in the same tree as them. Adult transfer and adult feeding tolerance was really, really rare. We only saw about 30 kind of food transfer events between adults over a 10-year period. So this is something that happens really, really rarely. Between mother and offspring, we saw more like 300 instances of food transfer. So it's not super common, but it's certainly more common than between mothers or between two adults, right? So what we see is that foods transferred from mothers to infants are eaten significantly more slowly than any of the other sort of relationships, right, between tolerance or transfer between adults. And so what this suggests to me is that mothers are sharing foods with their infants that in general take more time to eat. So that might suggest that they're more complicated. We also see that the foods transferred between mothers and infants are significantly heavier. So they're probably larger foods. They might have more stuff on them. But again, I think this suggests that they're probably more complicated than these sort of smaller, lighter foods. And finally, what we see is that fruits that are transferred between mothers and infants more frequently have more non-digestible carbohydrates. So there's actually more stuff that babies and adults aren't able to digest in the foods that are being transferred from mothers to offspring. Yeah.
So just because they aren't unable to digest it, do they still get any nutrients out of that, or they do? Okay. So,
oh, sorry. So I was just nodding about your question.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Do they still get nutrients out of it?
No, so most of the non-digestible carbohydrates, they don't really get any nutrients out of. Some of them, so some larger orangutans, so adults, have much longer guts, and they actually can sometimes ferment foods that they can't otherwise digest in their guts, and that lets them take out more energy. But because juveniles are so small, they don't have a gut that's big enough to let food sort of sit around in them for a while. So although adults might be able to get some energy out of it, infants and juveniles really, we don't think can. Yeah, that's a great question. So kind of what does this then mean? Well, we know mothers are transferring more complex foods to their children than less complex foods, right? And so this suggests that food sharing and also tolerating co-feeding is a way for mothers to transfer information to their offspring about how you actually eat a food. Right? And because orangutans have such a long childhood, this is something that can take a bunch of years to actually happen, right? And so like whoever had asked that great question mentioned, they're sort of buffered by the fact that they can always go back and nurse, right, when things get too tough. So there's not a lot of, so they have a buffer. They don't have to, it's not really like high pressure, I guess is what I mean. So obviously, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Is there any evidence, this is kind of, I don't know if this makes sense. Is there any evidence for moms that are able to produce milk longer or more milk if there's less fruit or food available?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we think that actually nursing, so we know that nursing is something that's energetically expensive for moms. It takes a lot of energy. And so it probably is not great for moms to continue nursing their offspring in these times when there isn't a lot of food available. So as I'll mention in the bottom of this slide, that's another question that we're really curious about because that's a unique adaptation that orangutans have. They nurse for much longer than any other primate. So as all of this has sort of alluded to, kind of the biggest question that we have, or the biggest thing that we need to answer these questions, is just more information, right? There are so many things about orangutans that we don't know. People have been studying orangutans in the wild since the mid-70s, so only about almost 50 years at this point in time. That's about the lifespan of an orangutan. So we're still, in some cases, on the first generation of orangutans that we've been studied. And so answering these questions about childhood and about life history, it's going to take a lot more time to be able to get enough data to give really concrete answers to some of the kinds of questions that you guys are asking. Yeah.
We have one that says, did you monitor all the activities 100% in person, or did you use cameras? Do you think there was any observer effect if they noticed you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have camera traps out in the forest, but we mostly use them as sort of a way to census the other animals that are in the forest and to sort of see which orangutans are passing the camera traps. Because orangutans are up in the trees and they have a really wide home range, it's hard to get sort of good data on individual orangutans' behavior just using camera traps. So the orangutans that we study are what we call habituated. So we spend a lot of time just sort of following them and getting them used to us being there. Obviously, the presence of people is going to change their behavior in some degree, but we say that they've been habituated when they stop kind of being alarmed or obviously looking at us during the course of the time that we're there. So every time that we're out there, we collect data on things like how frequently do the orangutans look at the people who are following them? How frequently are they, there's a vocalization that orangutans make when they're sort of distressed called a kiss squeak, which is sort of like, and so we count how many times they kiss squeak. And what we do is we have a threshold of sort of, this is like a comfortable orangutan that we think is behaving about normally. And if it's a new orangutan or somebody we haven't seen for a while, we don't use that data because we think that they're probably doing something differently. But it's definitely a trade-off, right? Because on the one hand, we want to know what they're doing. And the only way that we can really know what they're doing is by following them. But I know that following them to some degree changes their behavior. So the best example I have of this is from the research I did during my dissertation, where I was studying monkeys that were almost always up in the canopy because they're terrestrial predators like leopards. When humans were around, leopards would avoid the group. And so the monkeys spent a lot more time lower in the canopy and even traveling on the ground than the ones that we would see when we were just walking around the forest. So I know that we change their behavior, and it's sort of the trade-off, right, between do we not change their behavior but not understand anything about them, or do we accept that there's going to be some degree of change and do the best we can to sort of mitigate that? But yeah, that's a great question and something that primatologists are always kind of wrestling with. So in addition to trying to gather just more data in general about orangutans, there are some other really interesting things about learning to be an adult that I'm particularly interested in. So one question we have is, when do juveniles begin traveling like an adult, and how do they learn that, right? Orangutans are always up in the trees. Sometimes mothers will actually make bridges between tree branches and the babies will like walk across their body to transfer from tree to tree. But at some point in time, juveniles get big enough to start moving like adults. And so we've been collecting lots of data on how they're actually moving and when those transitions happen. And then the other thing is something that you asked about, when juvenile orangutans start digesting like adults, because we can look at what they're actually eating, but it's kind of digestion is a big black box. We can't actually see how much energy they're getting out of their food. And so what we're doing to answer this question is we're actually collecting feces, and we're looking at the amount of undigested fiber and other things in juvenile feces compared to their mothers. And so we can see they were eating, whether they were eating similar things, and then we can see how much fiber is in their feces relative to their mothers. And that would suggest that they're, what they're digesting relative to their moms. We can also look at the actual size of individual fecal particles, and that gives us a good proxy for how efficiently foods are being chewed. So those are two things that I'm working on right now that I'm pretty excited about. The other thing is another question that you guys immediately picked up on, is this idea of lactation, right? So orangutans nurse, we see kind of visually that orangutans are nursing for sometimes as much as 7 years, but because they're up in the tree and we're not with them at night, we don't know how much they're actually getting calories from that nursing and how much of it is maybe just comfort nursing. So we also want to know if this long period of nursing is challenging for moms, right? Because we suspect that during those times when orangutan juveniles would really want to nurse, mothers are also actually not eating as many calories. So again, we're collecting feces and we're hoping to look at, you can use isotopes to sort of see, basically what happens is when you're nursing, you're taking in calories and energy from another animal, essentially, right? You're drinking milk from your mother. So it looks isotopically like you're a carnivore. you can look on the food chain like you're actually one step up, like you're eating meat or something like that. And then as they begin incorporating more and more plant matter and less meat, they start to sort of, their isotope levels look more like their moms do. And so what we're doing right now, also with feces, is we're collecting feces from mothers and infants, and then we're going to look at the isotopic signatures to see if we can figure out how intensely juveniles are nursing and how many actual calories they're getting. And then looking at some markers of stress and health in their moms relative to food availability to see if it's actually presenting a challenge or a burden for their moms.
Scientists love poop.
I mean,
it tells us everything.
So much good stuff in it. It's really great.
And we do have one other question that I kind of saved because I figured we'd get into this a little more. But can you talk about the balance between the length of childhood and the cost to the mother at all?
Yeah, so that's really kind of the big question here, right? So what we think, do you mind if I come back to that and like?
No, yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. Right. So basically what we suspect, our sort of hypothesis about why orangutans are growing so slowly, is because being a big adult orangutan protects you from unpredictable food availability. When you're full-size adult, you're 300 pounds, you're 150, 200 pounds if you're a female, you've stored lots of fat in your body, and you can rely on that fat. You can use that fat when you're not able to take in enough calories. And even we see that orangutans can start to metabolize their own muscle tissue if they need to, because they're not taking in enough calories. So they're not going to starve. But it's hard to get enough calories and grow and learn and develop into being a full-grown adult orangutan in a short period of time, right? So what we think is that if you become too big too quickly, you'll probably starve. If you get really, really big because there was a mast when you were born, and you become, you gain 100 pounds in 2 years, and then there's no food available, you haven't put on enough fat and muscle to be able to metabolize that and protect yourself. So what we think is that growing really slowly lets juvenile orangutans protect themselves when there isn't a lot of fruit, because they're always putting on a little bit of fat, right? They're always able to take in essentially enough calories to sustain themselves. And so this is where we think there's a real trade-off for moms between having that really long childhood, which is probably pretty demanding for them in terms of their own energy. And it also means that they can't have a lot of babies. But what it does mean is that the likelihood that that baby will survive to adulthood is really, really good. So orangutans in the wild have juvenile mortality that's about at the same rate as Swiss people. Baby orangutans survive to adulthood. They don't have a lot of babies, and it takes them a long time. But if you make it to, if you are born as an orangutan, chances are you will survive. And so that's where that trade-off is. Yeah.
And so they typically only have one at once, right? Or if they have more, maybe only one would survive.
Yeah.
And how many times did you say in a lifespan a mom can have a baby?
So we think that she, at most, probably 4 or 5 babies. So they live to be, so again, we've only been studying them in the wild since the 70s. So, the very oldest orangutans have just started dying, who were born when we started studying them. So they're probably having 4 or 5 babies at the most, the moms. So making sure that each one survives is super important.
And where you were studying, was the population there pretty stable, or is it, relatively speaking, safe for the orangutans?
Yeah. So the place where I work is a national park. It's preserved. There have been some fires, and there have been some kind of incursion of logging and stuff. But in general, this population is incredibly well protected and very, very stable. So yeah, there's not a lot of fluctuation in these guys.
And I do want to note that the questions about nursing, the wonderful questions about lactation, came from mothers. So thinking about it.
Yep, good stuff. Yeah, it's cool. Primatology as a field has a lot of women scientists. And especially once more women started getting more sort of stability and power in the field, people started realizing that there were all of these sort of neglected questions about female primates and nursing and things like that are really being addressed. But yeah, it's a great insight that moms are asking different kinds of questions than people who haven't had that experience.
Right. And this one is a little more abstract, and it sounds like just because our experiences as humans with orangutans is so limited, we might not know this yet, but do we know anything about their metabolism or how it might change on years that produce a lot less food compared to the great years and stuff like that?
Yeah, so in terms of their actual metabolism, like their metabolism changing in terms of the like rate at which they're converting foods and stuff, I don't think we know about that. But what we do see is that their activity level changes pretty dramatically when there isn't a lot of fruit available. And so they might not be able to adjust their actual metabolism, but they're certainly adapting to sort of the local context and changing how much energy they're using on a regular basis. But yeah, that's a good question. There are a lot of things that you would think would be like the first, easy thing to answer. But because we're not able to work with them like physically, right? We can't dart them, we can't anesthetize them and do, experiments or something like that in the wild because they're critically endangered. There are a lot of questions about just physiology that we don't have the answers to. Some of those are things we're asking and answering in zoos, but a zoo context is going to be pretty different than a wild context if what we're interested in is these periods of scarcity. Yeah. So we think that basically during this long childhood, not only are they able to sort of pack on the fat and grow slowly enough that they're not going to starve, but they also learn from what and exactly how their mother is eating. And eventually, over lots and lots of years, they grow up. So I want to just pull this back a little bit to kind of the primatological, or I'm sorry, the anthropological question behind this, right? So studying orangutans shows us that long childhoods give us lots of time to grow and develop, even in a pretty marginal environment. This is one way that great apes have kind of adapted to an environment which is pretty challenging. So what does this kind of tell us about humans or human evolution, if anything? Well, if we think about human evolution, it's actually really, to my mind, a story about climate change. Our ancestors split off from the ancestors of modern chimpanzees about 6 or 7 million years ago. And what was going on the planet at this point in time is the planet was getting cooler and drier, just as an entire planet. And there were these big bands of rainforest circling most of the planet that started to fragment. And you have these sort of savanna landscapes that develop that we don't really have much experience in, but that's the sort of environment that our ancestors go into. And we know that our ancestors were facing a lot of this sort of seasonal instability, in addition to just the climate changing, and so things being unpredictable at a kind of macro level as well. So there are all sorts of reasons that human brain size increased, and paleoanthropologists will argue about them forever, right? There's lots and lots of things that drove the evolution of large brains in modern humans, but it had a lot of consequences for our species. And one of them, like I said at the very beginning, is those really, really kind of helpless babies. Babies that need lots and lots of help to survive. And so humans evolved along a really different trajectory than orangutans as kind of a way to deal with a similar problem. So we have really helpless babies in an unpredictable environment. And what humans and our ancestors did is we developed these complex social networks. When you are raising a baby, whether you're an Australopithecine or hopefully whether you're a human today, you are not raising that baby. It's not just you and the baby moving around the environment, right? You have family, you have a spouse or a partner who can help you often. You have parents, you have friends and aunts, and this whole community that helps raise these really helpless, really energy intensive babies. And so that's one reason that humans are able to have babies pretty quickly, is you can always, you can pass on the child care, and they can help with the child care in a lot of different ways. So it's not exactly as energetically demanding. Whereas what orangutans seem to have done is kind of separated out into really solitary individuals, and the mother and the baby move around as a unit, but there's no larger social network, right? So what we see is that there are lots of different ways to raise a helpless baby in a challenging environment. And what we've seemed to have done is chosen to be really social and have this really complicated social network, and that sort of helps explain our evolutionary trajectory. whereas orangutans have taken a similar challenge and done something totally different. And so understanding what orangutans do helps us understand sort of the consequences of the choices that humans have made. Yeah.
And are orangutans special in that they, among primates anyway, that they are extremely solitary? Are
Yeah,
most
diurnal primates, so most primates that are active during the day, are in social groups. You have some nocturnal primates that have a similar structure to orangutans, actually, where they're fairly solitary or semi-solitary, and then they'll bunch together at points. But yeah, orangutans have a pretty unique social structure, especially for the great apes. So with that, let me say thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all of these amazing questions, and to my collaborators and funders and the folks in Indonesia. And I would be willing to guess there are other questions, so I am happy to answer as people have any.
Well, I would love to hear about what it was like in the jungle, what it's like as a field researcher, and just hearing about those types of experiences.
Yeah, let me stop sharing my screen. Yeah, so I mean, the working in the forest is my favorite thing in the entire world. Being out in the forest, and you wake up really early, and as you get out to the orangutan's nest and it's still dark, and then as the sun starts to rise, you hear like the forest wake up, and so you get birds and other primates that are calling, and just like that like transition is one of the coolest things. So I've worked in Indonesia, I've worked in the Ivory Coast, I've worked in the Peruvian Amazon, all studying wild primates. And I think the thing that always surprises me is how quickly you get used to whatever environment you're in, right? After a little while, you're like, oh, okay, I saw 4 species of monkeys and, a gaboon viper and, an owl today, and it's not even 8 o'clock. Well, that's just the way life is. But every now and then something happens and you realize that you're like, this is exactly what I wanted to do when I was 13 years old. And so being able to be in that environment and do it is really exciting. It's not always glamorous. So as you might have noticed, there's a lot of poop that comes, that's very important. So I do spend a lot of time collecting excrement and urine from wild primates. And there are also, inconveniences. Like in Indonesia where we work, there are leeches everywhere. These ground leeches that will like try to climb up your legs and get into your clothes. I've had malaria a couple of times. There are snakes and stuff. So, there's a lot of stuff that is less than optimal, but actually being in the forest and being with the primates is really amazing. So it's all kind of worth it.
And do you know when you'll be able to go back?
I have no idea, unfortunately. Pretty much, so based on some research that's come out in the past couple of weeks, we think that all African and Asian primates are susceptible to COVID-19.
Wow.
And so realistically, one consequence of that is that we're not able to go back until people are vaccinated. And sort of another consequence of that, or well, even before we think about the primates, right? Me coming from a place like Boston, where we're, growing in case numbers right now, and going somewhere in rural Indonesia or rural West Africa where people don't have necessarily the same access to healthcare and health clinics, just wouldn't be ethical. And so, yeah, unfortunately, I don't know when I'll be able to get back out into the forest, but hopefully sometime soon.
Yeah. And we have one that says there have been studies about potential sign language communication between humans and chimps. Is there any sort of type of this research going on with orangutans? And
yeah.
What has it shown?
Yeah, so as far as sort of captive primates that are taught to use language, I believe there was an orangutan who was also taught sign language back in the 80s. And there's also some interesting research on captive primates, including orangutans, using what are called lexicograms, where they have like a chart with a bunch of pictures that are like symbols that are associated with different things. So kanji, the bonobo, is a famous lexigram using bonobo, but basically that provides, a way for kind of symbolic communication. In terms of wild primates, There's lots of interesting gestures that they use and sort of cultural behaviors, but there's no sort of one-to-one linguistic relationship, right? So what we think is that, at least in the wild, they have sort of perhaps the evolutionary basis to someday develop language in the way that we think about it, but they use gestural communication in a way that is distinct and is kind of specific to different primate species, but it's not exactly sign language.
And do you have a favorite fact about orangutans?
Favorite fact about orangutans?
Something that is just like mind-blowing.
Yeah, okay, so here's something really cool about orangutans. So orangutans' pelvises are, and femurs are absurdly flexible. So they can, like, there are times when they're, you know, like full more than splits moving from tree to tree, or like the mother will have her foot on one tree and her foot on another tree, and she's like dangling underneath and the baby is climbing across. So their hips and pelvises are crazy. But even cooler than that is, so they have, like most primates, they have opposable thumbs, but they also have opposable big toes. And their hands and feet are so dexterous that the official scientific term for them is quadrimanous, meaning that they have four hands, because their feet are just as dexterous and kind of nimble and able to do sort of fine motor skill things as their hands. And so there are pictures where you just look at kind of the thing that's holding onto a tree, and you can't tell if it's a hand or a foot because they look so similar.
Well, I was just about to say, so like the human foot, if we're looking at like a foot, the calcaneus, that heel bone, is very prominent. What the heck do their tarsals look like?
Yeah, so they have their tarsals, and their metatarsals look much more like their hands than they do like human feet. And so actually, in addition to brain size changing over human evolution, you can see a really clear trajectory of our feet going from being kind of like this sort of foot to, you know, our big toes move in line with the rest of our toes, and we get that really big calcaneus, and we get an arch in our foot. That's something that you can trace really clearly over human evolution. But actually, if you ever get the opportunity to take gross anatomy or watch a dissection, if you look at the muscles of human feet, we actually have all of the intrinsic muscles in our feet that would allow us to have opposable big toes if our big toes hadn't, you know, if the shape of our feet hadn't changed. All of those muscles are still there because of our common ancestry with somebody that was using their feet kind of as hands.
I'm proud that my toes can pick up pencils off the floor.
Oh, yeah, definitely you want to use that dexterity as best you can.
And we have one question that asks, what is the situation with palm oil plantations in Borneo?
Yeah, so that's something that gets an awful lot of attention, and it's really important. So a lot of forest that is not expressly protected is available for international corporations to use for palm oil plantations. And palm oil plantations and mining and logging are really responsible for a significant amount of deforestation in Indonesia in general and in Borneo in particular. And so it's very depressing to fly into our field site because you just see, you know, miles and miles and miles of palm oil. It's a tricky problem because a lot of communities want to have access to the sort of economic growth that comes from selling land for palm oil, right? And as an American who's deeply invested in orangutans, but still not somebody who's from Indonesia, who's part of these communities, I personally have problems with telling people what they can and can't do with their land. The project that I'm part of, the Gunung Palung Orangutan Conservation Project, has developed a really cool program where we work with local communities to actually get official titles to their land. So a lot of land in Indonesia is sort of customarily part of a particular village, but they don't actually own that land. And so the government can come in and, you know, sell that land to palm oil plantations. And so what my supervisor has done with her NGO is help communities get titles to their land. And so that gives them the opportunity to decide what to do with it and to keep governments from coming in and kind of deciding for them that it's going for palm oil. So I think the best hope that that orangutans have and that conservationists have is to work really closely with local communities and really figure out how communities can benefit from having protection of their forest. I went to a really interesting talk yesterday that pointed out for Indonesian villagers, a lot of times palm oil comes and takes away access to forests that they've used traditionally. Mining does the same thing, but so do conservationists who come in and protect a forest and say, sorry, this is for orangutans, it's not for you, right? And so I think that what needs to happen is kind of these conversations with communities that help people still make use of the forest that they use for things, you know, these non-timber forest products that people eat or use for housing and things like that. And protecting the forest for communities and orangutans at the same time, I think is going to be the way forward that helps preserve as much forest. And so in terms of what you can do for palm oil, I would say that sustainable palm oil choices, you know, where people are talking about sustainable palm oil, it's good to use that. But it's also important, I think, to think about the fact that as consumers in North Carolina or in Boston, we're living in a really different context than the people in Indonesia. And so to some degree, you know, all we can do is help people claim ownership of their land and decide what they want to do with it.
It very much seems like that's going to be a huge part of the solution in many of the rainforests is making it a local, maybe not local issue, but making sure everyone's aware of every side of it.
Yeah.
And then we can end with this last question of how do you feel and how do conservationists feel about orangutans' future?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think we've got to be hopeful because otherwise, you know, why am I here documenting these really exciting and interesting things if it's for them to go extinct in 20 years, right? So like I said, I think there's a lot of hope in communities getting ownership of their land and choosing what to do with it. And often that can involve protecting and preserving land for orangutans. But I do think that there are, you know, climate change is going to make an unpredictable environment even more unpredictable. There have been major fires in Indonesia over the past few years, and those have really affected habitat and things like that. So it's not a rosy picture for orangutans in the future, really for any great ape. I think there's going to need really committed attention and money and dedicated folks from, you know, all different countries working to preserve them. But I don't think it's hopeless. I think that there's a lot of, you know, especially what's been exciting for me in Boston, sitting in this basement room, very far from the rainforest, is knowing that we have a team of Indonesians who are really committed. They're doing research, they're taking ownership of these projects, they're continuing conservation and research. And so I think that there are lots of people who will be able to sort of carry on the mantle. And I'm pretty
Shout out to lab mates.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Erin, thank you so much for spending your morning with us and sharing some of your research with us. I love hearing about all of these exciting animals. It makes me feel like I'm a kid, and it's great to hear all about your passion and everything. So thank you so much, everyone. This was Dr. Erin Kane, a postdoc at Boston University. And if there are any additional questions that come in, I will chase you down.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It was great chatting with everyone.
Have a good afternoon.